Montana Territory, September 1882. The autumn wind carried dust through Silver Ridge's frontier market, swirling it into thin columns that danced between the wooden stalls and half-loaded wagons. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town square, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. It was the kind of light that made honest men look tired and desperate men look dangerous. Caleb Thorne rode into town with the quiet confidence of a man who had survived worse days than this. At 40 years old, he sat tall in the saddle, his shoulders squared despite the weight of 8 years lived alone. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his face carried the weathered look of a man who had known both war and loss. He wore a simple wool coat over a cotton shirt, practical boots worn smooth by years of hard work, and a Winchester Model 1873 secured in the saddle holster. The rifle was not for show. Men who knew Caleb Thorne understood that much. He had come to town for supplies, nothing more. A new hinge for the barn door, 20 pounds of grain, maybe some coffee, if Josiah Miller's store still stocked the good kind from back east. Caleb preferred his trips to Silver Ridge short and purposeful. Towns carried too many memories, too many reminders of the life he had lost when his wife Sarah and their 12-year-old son Samuel died of plague fever 8 years ago. He had been away on business, driving cattle to Wyoming, when sickness took them. By the time he returned home, they had been in the ground for 3 days. The guilt still lived in his chest like a stone he could not swallow. The market square was quieter than usual. A handful of vendors stood behind their tables, calling out prices with little enthusiasm. Children kicked stones near the water trough while their parents browsed without buying. A dog lay sleeping in a patch of sunlight. Everything moved slowly, as if the town itself was waiting for something to happen. That was when Caleb saw her. She stood near the eastern edge of the square, isolated from the crowd like a piece of driftwood washed up on an empty shore. She was young, perhaps 24, with long brown hair that hung loose around her shoulders. A thin gray blanket covered her front, but it hung askew on one side, barely protecting her from the September chill. Her feet were bare against the rough wooden planks, and her arms showed faint bruises that spoke of rough handling. But it was her eyes that caught Caleb's attention. They were gray and steady, refusing to look away even as men passed her with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. She reminded him of Sarah, not in appearance but in the way she held herself. That same quiet strength beneath the fear, that same refusal to collapse even when the world pressed down hard. Caleb dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dirt with a solid thud. He tied his mare to a post and walked toward the woman, studying the situation with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read danger from a distance. A fat merchant in a stained vest stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the square with bored impatience. "How much?" Caleb asked, his voice low and even. The merchant turned, sizing Caleb up with a practiced eye. $20. Been here since noon. No takers." He spat into the dust. Silas Webb dropped her off, said he'd be back. That was 3 hours ago. Caleb had heard of Silas Webb, a trader who dealt in what he called labor contracts, buying and selling people who had nowhere else to go. The law allowed it, technically. After the war ended slavery, men like Webb found loopholes: debt bondage, indentured servitude. Pretty names for ugly business. Caleb stepped closer to the woman. She tensed but did not back away. Her hands gripped his blanket tighter, knuckles white with the effort of staying calm. "Do you want to leave here?" Caleb asked her directly. The woman's eyes widened slightly. It was a small reaction, but Caleb saw it: surprise, confusion, and beneath that, a flicker of hope she was afraid to trust. No one had asked her opinion in a very long time. She nodded once, a single, careful movement of her head. Caleb turned back to the merchant, reaching into his coat pocket. He counted out $20 in silver coins, each one clinking as it landed on the merchant's open palm. The man grinned, pocketed the money, and walked away without another word. No receipt, no paperwork, just a transaction between men who understood how the frontier worked. Caleb removed his coat and held it out to the woman. She stared at it for a moment, as if unsure whether accepting it would create some new debt she could not afford. But the wind picked up, and the cold cut through the thin blanket. She reached forward slowly, her fingers brushing Caleb's hand as she took the coat. Her skin was ice cold. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, like she had not used it in days. Before Caleb could respond, a sharp shout cut through the square. "Stop! That boy is mine!" A young boy, no more than 14, came sprinting out from behind a wagon. He was thin, with dark hair and bronze skin that marked him as mixed blood, likely Lakota and Irish. His clothes were torn and his feet were bare like the woman's. Behind him, a tall man in a black coat strode forward, fury etched across his weathered face. Silas Webb. The boy tried to run past Caleb, but Webb lunged forward and grabbed the back of his shirt, yanking him off his feet. The boy hit the ground hard, gasping for air. Webb stood over him, one boot pressed against the boy's back. "This little half-breed owes me $80, Webb said loudly, making sure everyone in the square could hear. "He works for me until that debt is paid. That's the law." Caleb looked down at the boy. The child's eyes met his, wide with terror but also something else. Defiance. The same look Samuel used to give when he refused to back down from a fight, even when he knew he would lose. Something shifted in Caleb's chest. It was not pity, it was recognition. He had failed to save Samuel. He had been too far away, too late, too powerless against the fever that took his son. But this boy was here, now, and Caleb still had the strength to do something about it. "How much?" Caleb asked Webb. Webb's eyes narrowed. "You already bought the girl. You looking to start a charity?" "How much for the boy?" Caleb repeated, his tone flat and unyielding. Webb studied him for a long moment, then smiled. It was not a kind smile. $80, and that's a bargain. Caleb counted out the money without hesitation. $80 was nearly half of what he had saved from last season's wheat harvest. But money could be earned again. Time could not be bought back. Webb snatched the coins, tested one with his teeth, then shoved the boy toward Caleb. The boy stumbled but did not fall. He stood frozen, staring at Caleb like a wild animal, unsure whether to run or stay. "You know what you just bought, Thorne?" Webb said, his voice low enough that only Caleb could hear. "Two liabilities. The girl's been passed around 5 times in 3 years. Nobody keeps her long, and the boy? He's got Indian blood. People around here don't take kindly to that." He leaned closer. "You'll regret this, and when you do, I'll be back to collect. Not just them, but everything you got, including that land of yours." Caleb met Webb's gaze without flinching. "If you come to my land, uninvited, you better bring more than talk." Webb's smile widened. He tipped his hat mockingly, turned, and walked away, whistling a tune that echoed through the now silent market square. Caleb turned to the woman and the boy. They stood together but separate, both wary, both waiting for the next blow to fall. "My name is Caleb Thorne," he said quietly. "I have a homestead about 2 hours from here. You can come with me. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to sell you. But if you want to run, now's the time." The woman looked at the boy looked at the woman. Neither of them moved. "We'll come," the woman said finally. Caleb nodded. He gestured toward his mare. "You ride. I'll walk." The woman hesitated, then climbed onto the saddle with surprising grace despite her exhaustion. The boy climbed up behind her, gripping the saddle horn with both hands. Caleb took the reins and began leading the horse out of town, his rifle resting casually across his shoulder. They had been on the trail for less than 20 minutes when trouble found them. 2 men stepped out from behind a cluster of rocks, blocking the narrow path. They were young, maybe mid-20s, with the hard eyes and dirty clothes of men who survived by taking from others. One held a rusted revolver, the other carried a knife. "Afternoon," the one with the revolver said, grinning. "That's a nice horse, and an even nicer-looking woman. Why don't you hand over your money and leave the girl? We'll take good care of her." Caleb did not stop walking. He did not raise his voice. He simply shifted his weight slightly, his right hand drifting toward the rifle slung across his back. "Last chance," Caleb said calmly. "Walk away." The man with the revolver laughed. "You think you're fast, old man?" Caleb's hand moved. The Winchester came off his shoulder in one smooth, practiced motion. The shot cracked through the air before the man could even lift his revolver. The bullet struck the dirt between the man's boots, close enough that dust sprayed up over his pants. The second shot came half a second later. this time hitting the revolver itself and sending it spinning out of the man's hand. He yelped and stumbled backward, clutching his stinging fingers. His partner dropped the knife and raised both hands. "Go," Caleb said. They went, fast. Caleb reloaded without hurry, then slung the rifle back over his shoulder and resumed walking. Behind him, the woman and the boy sat in stunned silence. "Are you going to kill us?" the boy asked quietly. Caleb glanced back. "No." "Why not?" "Because I've killed enough people for one lifetime." They rode in silence after that. The sun sank lower, turning the sky into shades of orange and purple. The land stretched wide and empty around them, broken only by scattered pine trees and distant hills. It was harsh country, beautiful and brutal in equal measure, the kind of place that killed weak men and tempered strong ones. By the time they reached Caleb's homestead, twilight had settled over the valley. The cabin sat alone on a low rise, its roof slanted and sturdy, its chimney faintly warm from the morning fire. There was a barn to the left, a chicken coop to the right, and a well near the front porch. 160 acres of land stretched out behind the cabin, most of it planted with wheat that had been harvested weeks ago. Everything was clean, orderly, functional, but it lacked warmth. There were no curtains in the windows, no flowers in the yard, no signs of laughter or life. Caleb helped the woman and the boy down from the horse. He led the mare to the barn, unsaddled her, and gave her fresh water and oats. Then he turned to his two new companions, who stood awkwardly in the yard, unsure what to do. "Come inside," Caleb said. The cabin's interior was simple. A single room with a wood stove in the corner, a sturdy table with two chairs, a bed pushed against the far wall, and shelves lined with tools, canned goods, and a few books. A rocking chair sat near the stove, its wood worn smooth by years of use. On the mantel above the stove, there was a small framed photograph of a woman and a young boy, Sarah and Samuel, smiling. Caleb gestured toward the bed. "You sleep there," he said to the woman. Then he pointed to the rocking chair. "You can use that," he told the boy. "I'll sleep on the floor." The woman stared at him. "Why?" "Because it's the right thing to do." The boy spoke up, his voice cautious. "What do you want from us?" Caleb sat down at the table, his movements slow and deliberate. He was tired, not just from the day, but from the years. "I want you to live, to learn, to decide your own future. Nobody owns you anymore. Not Webb, not me, not anyone." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly, refusing to let them fall. "What if we want to leave?" "Then you leave. But if you stay, you work. This land is 160 acres. One man can't farm it alone. If you help me, we'll survive the winter. Come spring, you decide if you want to stay or go." The boy and the woman exchanged glances. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they nodded. Caleb stood and walked to a wooden chest in the corner. He opened it and pulled out two sets of old clothes, a dress that had belonged to Sarah, a shirt and trousers that had belonged to Samuel. He placed them on the table. "These belonged to my wife and son. They died 8 years ago. You can wear them until I buy you new clothes tomorrow." The woman touched the dress gently, as if it were made of glass. "Thank you." That night, Caleb sat by the stove while the woman and the boy slept. He held the photograph of Sarah and Samuel in his hands, studying their faces in the flickering firelight. He had not let anyone into his life since they died. He had built walls around his heart, convinced that loving meant losing, and losing meant pain he could not survive twice. But tonight, those walls felt thinner. He looked at the woman curled up on the bed, the boy asleep in the rocking chair. They were strangers, broken people with pasts he did not know. But they were here, alive. And for the first time in 8 years, the cabin did not feel quite so empty. Caleb set the photograph down and closed his eyes. "Hera," he whispered into the silence. "If you're watching, I hope this is what you wanted. I hope I'm doing the right thing." The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere far away, 20 miles down the road, Silas Webb sat in a dim saloon, holding a piece of paper with Caleb Thorne's forged signature on it, a promissory note for $500 that Caleb had never signed. Webb smiled as he folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket. Tomorrow he would file a claim with a territorial court, and soon everything Caleb Thorne owned would belong to him. But tonight, in the quiet cabin on the Montana prairie, three lost souls slept under one roof. And for the first time in a very long time, none of them were alone. Morning came slowly to the Montana prairie, the sun rising over the eastern hills like a promise the land was not sure it could keep. Caleb woke before dawn, as he always did, his body trained by years of solitary routine. He rose from the floor where he had slept on a thin bedroll, his back stiff but manageable. At 40, he was still strong, still capable, but he felt the weight of age in ways he had not at 30. He moved quietly, not wanting to wake the woman and the boy who slept in positions that suggested they had not truly rested in months. He stepped outside into the crisp morning air, his breath forming small clouds that dissolved into nothing. The valley stretched before him, vast and silent, painted in shades of gray and gold. This land had been his salvation after Sarah and Samuel died. It gave him purpose when grief had threatened to pull him under. Every fence post he drove into the ground, every row of wheat he planted, every stone he cleared from the fields, had been an act of defiance against the emptiness. But it had also been lonely, achingly, desperately lonely. He walked to the well and drew up a bucket of cold water, splashing it on his face to clear the fog of sleep. Then he went to the barn to check on the mare and feed the chickens. The animals knew him, trusted him. They did not ask questions or demand explanations. They simply existed alongside him, day after day, in a rhythm that had become his entire world. When he returned to the cabin, the woman was awake. She sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing Sarah's old dress, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as he entered, her gray eyes cautious but alert. "Good morning," Caleb said quietly. "Good morning," she replied. Her voice was steadier than it had been yesterday, though still edged with uncertainty. The boy stirred in the rocking chair, blinking sleep from his eyes. He sat up quickly, instinctively scanning the room for danger, before relaxing slightly when he saw only Caleb and the woman. Caleb moved to the stove and began building a fire. His movements were practiced and efficient. Within minutes, flames crackled to life, warming the cabin's interior. He placed a cast iron skillet on the stove and began slicing salt pork and bread. "I don't have much for breakfast," Caleb said. "But there's enough." The woman stood and approached the stove. "Let me help." Caleb paused, then nodded. "There's water in the bucket, coffee grounds in the tin." She worked alongside him without speaking, her movements careful and deliberate. The boy watched them both, still wary, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Caleb understood that wariness. He had lived with it himself after the war, after watching friends die in mud and blood for causes that felt less clear with every passing year. They sat at the table together, the three of them, and ate in silence. The food was simple but filling. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way Caleb preferred it. When they finished, the woman cleared the plates without being asked, washing them in the basin with the same quiet efficiency she had shown earlier. Caleb stood and walked to the door. "I need to fix a section of fence today. The wind knocked some posts loose last week. Thomas, you come with me." The boy looked up, surprised. "Thomas? You need a name. That one suits you." The boy, now Thomas, hesitated, then nodded slowly. It was not his real name, but then again, he had been called so many things by so many people that he was not sure he remembered what his real name was anymore. Thomas was as good as any. Caleb turned to the woman. "You can stay inside if you want, or come out. Your choice." "I'll come," she said immediately. They walked together across the homestead, Caleb carrying tools and a bundle of wooden posts, Thomas walking beside him, and the woman following a few paces behind. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist that clung to the low places in the valley. The air smelled of earth and pine and the faint sweetness of dying wildflowers. When they reached the damaged fence line, Caleb set down his tools and showed Thomas how to measure the distance between posts, how to dig the holes deep enough to hold firm against the wind, how to drive the nails at the right angle so the wood would not split. He spoke calmly, without impatience, repeating instructions when Thomas made mistakes, but never raising his voice. "A fence is only as strong as its weakest post," Caleb said. "You want to build something that lasts, you do it right the first time." Thomas gripped the hammer awkwardly, his hands unused to the weight and balance of the tool. He swung and missed the nail, swore under his breath, then swung again. This time the nail sank halfway into the wood. By the third swing, it was flush. Good, Caleb said. You learned fast. Thomas looked up, surprised by the praise. Really? I don't lie. If you do good work, I'll tell you. If you do bad work, I'll tell you that too. But I'll always teach you how to fix it. They worked for 2 hours, the sun warm on their backs, the rhythm of hammer strikes echoing across the prairie. The woman sat on a nearby rock watching them. At first, Caleb thought she was simply resting. But then he noticed her hands moving, picking up scattered pieces of kindling and stacking them in neat piles. She was contributing in her own way, without being asked, without expecting acknowledgement. When they paused to drink water from the canteen Caleb had brought, he pointed to a distant hill that rose above the tree line. My son is buried there, Caleb said quietly. Samuel. He died when he was 12. Fever took him and his mother in the same week. Thomas looked toward the hill, then back at Caleb. Do you go there? Every Sunday, rain or shine. What do you say? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. I tell them about the week, the weather, the crops, small things. I don't know if they hear me, but it feels right. The woman spoke for the first time that morning. They hear you. Caleb met her eyes. There was something in her gaze that reminded him of Sarah's quiet faith, the way she had believed in things that could not be seen or proven. He did not know if he shared that faith anymore, but he wanted to. They returned to the cabin at midday. Caleb prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, while Thomas hauled water from the well and the woman swept the cabin floor. The work fell into a natural rhythm, each of them finding a role without needing to be told. It was not family, not yet, but it was something closer to it than Caleb had felt in 8 years. After they ate, Caleb pulled out a leather-bound ledger from the shelf above his bed. He placed it on the table in front of the woman. Can you read? He asked. She nodded. A little. Good. This is the farm's account book. Income, expenses, profits. I'm not good with numbers. Never have been. If you can learn to manage this, it would help. The woman stared at the ledger as if it were a treasure chest. You want me to keep your books? If you're willing. With Dom, Caleb sat down across from her. Because if something happens to me, you need to know how to run this place. You need to know what's owed, what's saved, what's coming. You need to be able to protect yourself. She reached out slowly and opened the ledger, her fingers tracing the columns of numbers and dates. I'll learn. Caleb pulled a small iron key from his pocket and placed it on the table. This opens the strongbox under my bed. That's where I keep the money. From now on, you hold the key. The woman's eyes widened. You trust me? I do. She picked up the key, holding it in her palm like it weighed more than iron. Because trust has to start somewhere. That evening, they sat together at the table, eating stew that the woman had prepared using the last of the salted beef and vegetables from Caleb's root cellar. It was the best meal Caleb had eaten in months, not because the food was extraordinary, but because he was not eating alone. Can I ask you something? Thomas said, breaking the comfortable silence. Caleb nodded. Why did you buy us? You could have kept your money. You could have walked away. Caleb set down his spoon and looked at the boy. Because I know what it feels like to need someone and have no one come. You were a soldier, Thomas said. It was not a question. I was. Did you kill people? The woman tensed, but Caleb did not flinch. Yes. How many? Enough that I don't sleep well most nights. Thomas considered this. Do you regret it? Caleb was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy with truth. I regret every single one, even the ones I had to kill, even the ones who would have killed me if I hadn't. War doesn't give you the luxury of good choices. It just forces you to make choices and then live with them. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin shutters. I'm sorry, Thomas said softly. Don't be sorry, just remember it. Remember that violence isn't glory, it's weight, and you carry it forever. The woman spoke then, her voice quiet but firm. My name was taken from me. Every place I went, they gave me a new one. Mary, Ruth, Claire. I don't remember which one was real anymore. Caleb looked at her. You can choose a new one that belongs only to you. I don't know what to choose. You will, when you're ready. She nodded, and for the first time since he had met her, she smiled. It was a small smile, fragile as glass, but it was real. They were preparing for bed when the sound of hooves broke the evening quiet. Caleb moved to the window, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning against the wall. A single rider approached, silhouetted against the dying light. Caleb recognized the horse before he recognized the man. It was Sheriff Morrison, an old friend from the war, who now kept what little peace existed in Silver Ridge. Caleb stepped outside, leaving the rifle inside but keeping his hand near the revolver at his hip. Morrison dismounted slowly, his weathered face grim. "Caleb," Morrison said by way of greeting. "James." Morrison removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "I wish I was here for a social visit, but you're not." "No, Silas Webb filed a complaint with the territorial court this morning. Says you owe him $500 from a grain purchase back in '78. He's got a promissory note with your signature on it." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I never borrowed money from Webb. Not $1. "I figured as much, but the note looks official. Judge Harlan is old and half blind. If Webb pushes this, the court might side with him. Montana law says if you don't pay within 30 days, the creditor can seize assets. That includes land. He's after the homestead." Morrison nodded. "And more. He's claiming those two you brought home are still under contract to him. Says you interfered with a legal transaction." Caleb felt cold fury settle in his chest. "They're not going back to him." "I know, but you need proof that note is fake, and you need it fast." "I bought grain from Josiah Miller in '78. He keeps records." Morrison's expression darkened. "Webb knows that. He visited Josiah this afternoon, told him if he testifies for you, his store might burn down. Josiah's got a wife and 3 grandchildren. He's scared, Caleb." Caleb looked back at the cabin where Thomas and the woman stood in the doorway listening. They had just begun to hope, just begun to believe that safety might be possible, and now Webb was coming for them again. "What do I do?" Caleb asked. Morrison stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Find another way to prove that signature is fake. There's a handwriting expert in Helena, name of Fletcher, former court clerk. If anyone can prove forgery, it's him. Helena is 80 miles. I know, but it's your best chance." Morrison paused. "One more thing. Webb's got 5 men working for him now. All of them ex-soldiers, the kind who fight for money and don't ask questions. If the court doesn't give him what he wants, he'll come for it anyway." Caleb nodded slowly. "Then I'll be ready." Morrison mounted his horse, then looked down at Caleb with something like regret in his eyes. "I wish I could do more, but my hands are tied until he breaks the law outright. You've done enough by warning me." Morrison rode away into the gathering darkness, leaving Caleb standing alone in the yard. He did not move for a long time, his mind working through the problem like a man planning a military campaign. He had 30 days to prove the note was fake, 30 days to protect the people who depended on him. 30 days before Webb came to take everything. When he finally went back inside, Thomas and the woman were waiting. "He's coming for us, isn't he?" Thomas asked. "Yes." "What do we do?" Caleb walked to the shelf and began pulling down boxes of ammunition. "We prepare. Tomorrow, I teach you both how to shoot." The woman stepped forward. "I've never held a gun." "You will tomorrow." Thomas looked at the pile of ammunition growing on the table. "Are we going to have to fight?" Caleb met the boy's eyes. "I hope not. But hope isn't a plan. If Webb comes here, I won't let him take you. I couldn't save my son, but I can save you." That night, Caleb did not sleep. He sat at the table, cleaning and loading every weapon he owned. The Winchester, the revolver, an old cavalry saber from his war days that he kept wrapped in oilcloth. He worked by lamplight, his hands steady, his mind clear. He had been a soldier once. He had fought in battles where men died screaming in the mud. He had thought those days were behind him. But some things, he realized, you never really leave behind. They just wait in the shadows until you need them again. Across the table, the woman sat writing in the ledger, practicing her numbers and letters by the same lamplight. Thomas lay on the floor pretending to sleep but watching Caleb through half-closed eyes. None of them spoke, but they were together. And that, Caleb thought, was worth fighting for. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Montana prairie, the kind of morning that made a man's breath visible and his fingers stiff until the sun climbed high enough to offer mercy. Caleb stood in the yard behind the cabin, setting up targets against a fallen log. Empty tin cans, pieces of wood with circles drawn in charcoal, anything that would give Thomas and the woman something to aim at. He had been awake for hours, running through the plan in his mind, testing it for weaknesses the way a good officer tested battle strategies before committing men to the field. Thomas emerged from the cabin first, dressed in Samuel's old clothes that hung slightly loose on his thin frame. The boy moved with the cautious energy of someone still adjusting to the idea that he was allowed to exist without permission. Behind him came the woman, wrapped in Sarah's shawl against the morning chill. She had pulled her hair back into a practical braid, and her gray eyes held a determination that had not been there 2 days ago. Caleb held up the Winchester. This is a repeating rifle, holds 15 rounds. It's accurate up to 300 yards in the right hands. You're not going to have the right hands today. Maybe not for months, but you're going to relearn the basics. He demonstrated the loading mechanism, his movements slow and deliberate so they could follow. Then he showed them how to shoulder the weapon properly, how to sight down the barrel, how to control their breathing before squeezing the trigger. Thomas watched with intense focus. The woman watched with something closer to fear. "I don't want to hurt anyone," she said quietly. Caleb met her eyes. "Neither do I, but if men come here looking to hurt you, I need to know you can defend yourself. This isn't about wanting violence. It's about surviving it." He handed Thomas the rifle first. The boy took it carefully, mimicking the stance Caleb had demonstrated. He aimed at the nearest tin can, his hands shaking slightly from the weight of the weapon and the weight of what it represented. "Breathe," Caleb said. "Squeeze the trigger like you're trying not to wake someone sleeping next to you." Slow and steady. Thomas fired. The shot cracked across the prairie, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. The bullet struck dirt 3 feet to the left of the target. Thomas swore under his breath. "Again," Caleb said. Thomas fired 5 more times. On the 6th shot, he hit the tin can, sending it spinning off the log. His face broke into a grin. "Good," Caleb said. "Now do it 4 more times in a row." By mid-morning, Thomas had developed a basic competency. He would never be a marksman, but he could hit a man-sized target at 50 yards more often than not. That would have to be enough. The woman took the rifle next. Her hands shook worse than Thomas's had, and her first shot went so wide that Caleb could not even see where the bullet landed. But she did not give up. She fired again and again, her jaw set with stubborn determination. On her 15th attempt, she grazed the edge of a wooden target. On her 20th, she hit it square. "I did it," she whispered, as if afraid saying it louder would make it untrue. "You did," Caleb confirmed. Again. They practiced until the sun reached its zenith, until their shoulders ached and their ears rang from the gunfire. When Caleb finally called a halt, he saw something new in their faces. Not confidence exactly, but the beginning of it. The fragile knowledge that they were not completely helpless. They ate a cold lunch of bread and cheese while Caleb explained the next step. "We need proof that Webb's promissory note is forged. Sheriff Morrison says there's a man in Helena who can examine handwriting and testify in court. His name is Harrison Fletcher. He's our best chance." "Helena is far," Thomas said. 2 days' ride, maybe 3 if the weather turns. Caleb looked at the woman. "I'll need you to come with me. Thomas stays here to watch the homestead." Thomas sat up straighter. "I can defend it." "You can. I'll leave you the Winchester and 2 boxes of ammunition. If anyone comes who isn't Sheriff Morrison, you don't open the door. You don't engage. You make noise, fire warning shots, and buy time until we get back. Understood?" Thomas nodded, trying to hide how frightened he was at the prospect of being alone. The woman spoke quietly. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow morning, first light. Pack light. We'll sleep rough one night on the trail." That afternoon, Caleb saddled 2 horses while the woman prepared supplies for the journey. Dried meat, hardtack, coffee, a bedroll each. Thomas helped in silence, his movements tense with worry he would not voice. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Caleb found the boy sitting on the porch steps, staring at nothing. Caleb sat down beside him. "You're scared." "I don't want to be alone." "You won't be alone. You'll be protecting our home. That's different." Thomas looked at him. "This isn't my home. Not really. You just bought me 3 days ago." Caleb was quiet for a moment. My son Samuel died in this cabin. I held him while the fever burned him up from the inside. I buried him on that hill over there. For 8 years, I thought this place was just a tomb I happened to live in. He gestured toward the cabin. But these last 3 days, it's felt different. Like maybe it could be a home again. Not because of the building, because of the people in it. You miss him, Thomas said. Samuel, every single day. I remind you of him. Yes. Thomas was quiet, processing this. Is that why you saved me? Because I look like him? Caleb turned to face the boy fully. I saved you because you needed saving. But I'm asking you to stay because I need you. And she needs you, and maybe, just maybe, we can be something like a family, if you're willing. Thomas's eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. He nodded once, sharp and quick, then stood and walked back inside before emotion could overwhelm him. That evening, Caleb retrieved a small wooden box from beneath his bed. Inside was a leather pouch containing $60, nearly all the money he had left after buying Thomas and the woman and paying for supplies. He counted out $40 and handed them to Thomas. If something happens to us, this will get you through winter. Buy food from Josiah Miller. He'll give you fair prices. Nothing's going to happen, Thomas said fiercely. Probably not, but a smart man plans for the worst and hopes for the best. The woman appeared in the doorway. We should rest. Tomorrow will be a long day. Caleb nodded, but rest did not come easily. He lay on his bedroll, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the journey ahead. He had not been to Helena in 5 years, not since he filed the final paperwork to secure his land title under the Homestead Act. The city would be bigger now, more dangerous, full of the kind of men who saw opportunities in other people's desperation. He would need to keep his wits sharp and his hand close to his gun. Beside him, the woman lay awake as well. He could tell by the way she breathed, quick and shallow, the rhythm of someone whose mind would not quiet. Are you afraid? She asked into the darkness. Yes. Of what? Caleb considered the question. Of failing, again. You didn't fail, Samuel. You were just human. Being human isn't good enough when people depend on you. She turned toward him, though in the darkness he could only make out the shape of her. You saved me. You saved Thomas. You've given us more than anyone else ever did. That counts for something. It won't count for anything if Webb takes it all away. Then we won't let him. The simple certainty in her voice steadied something in Caleb's chest. He reached out in the darkness, found her hand, and squeezed it once. She squeezed back. It was not love, not yet, but it was connection, and that was enough to carry him into sleep. They left at dawn, the sky still purple with the last remnants of night. Thomas stood in the doorway, the Winchester held across his chest in a way that was trying very hard to look confident. Caleb clasped the boy's shoulder once, said nothing because there was nothing left to say, and mounted his horse. The woman climbed onto the second horse with practiced ease, her face set with determination. They rode east toward the rising sun, following the wagon road that connected the scattered homesteads and mining camps to the territorial capital. The land rolled beneath them, endless and indifferent, shaped by wind and time into something that could break a weak soul or temper a strong one. Caleb had been both in his life. He hoped he had landed somewhere closer to strong. By midday, they reached a crossroads where the trail split. One path led northeast toward Helena. The other curved south toward Silveritos. Caleb guided them north, into country he had not traveled in years. The land grew rockier here, studded with pine trees and broken by narrow canyons where shadows pooled thick and cold even in daylight. They stopped to rest the horses near a stream that cut through a stand of aspens. While the animals drank, the woman refilled their canteens and Caleb scanned the surrounding terrain with the automatic caution of a man who had survived ambushes before. Do you think Webb knows we left? She asked. He will soon. He's got men watching. That's what I'd do. What happens if they follow us? Then we deal with it. She studied his face. You're different out here, harder. Out here is where you have to be hard. The prairie doesn't care about your feelings. It only cares if you're strong enough to survive it. They rode through the afternoon in companionable silence, the kind that settles between people who have moved beyond the need to fill every quiet moment with words. As the sun began its descent, they reached a sheltered hollow surrounded by rock walls on 3 sides. Good cover. defensible. Caleb called a halt, and they made camp. He built a small fire while the woman unpacked their supplies. They ate jerky and hardtack, washed down with water that tasted of stone and minerals. When full darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and they sat close to the fire for warmth. "Can I ask you something?" the woman said. "Always. Why didn't you remarry after Sarah died? You're not old. You could have found someone." Caleb stared into the flames. "I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of losing again. Losing Sarah and Samuel nearly killed me. I couldn't survive that twice. So I just stopped feeling anything, stopped hoping, stopped trying. I thought that was safer." "Was it?" "No, it was just lonelier." She moved closer, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I've been afraid, too. Afraid to trust anyone. Every person I ever trusted sold me or hurt me, or both. When you bought me in that market, I thought you'd be the same, just slower about it. And now? Now I think maybe you're just a man trying to do the right thing in a world that doesn't make it easy." Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her. In the firelight, her face was softer, the hard edges of survival giving way to something more vulnerable. He realized he did not even know her name, or what she wanted to be called, or what her dreams had been before they were beaten out of her by years of cruelty. "What do you want?" he asked. "If we win this, if we save the homestead and Webb goes away, what do you want your life to look like?" She was quiet for a long time. "I want to stop running. I want to wake up in the same place 2 days in a row and not be afraid. I want to learn things. How to read better. How to manage a farm. How to be more than just something men buy and sell." She paused. "And I want a name. A real one I choose. You'll have all of that. I promise. You can't promise that." "No, but I can fight for it, and I will." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and Caleb let her. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers, feeling the coal press in from all sides. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "I think I'm starting to care about you, and that terrifies me." "I care about you too," Caleb said quietly, "more than I thought possible." "What if it goes wrong?" "Then at least we'll have tried." She lifted her head and looked at him. In that moment, Caleb understood what it meant to stand on the edge of something new and terrifying and necessary. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not. Their lips met, soft and tentative, a question asked and answered without words. When they parted, both were trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of hope they had thought lost forever. They did not speak again that night. They lay down side by side in their bedrolls, hands clasped between them, staring up at a sky so crowded with stars, it looked like holes punched in black fabric to let the light through. Caleb thought about Sarah, wondered if she would approve or be hurt. But mostly he thought that Sarah would want him to live, truly live, not just survive. And for the first time since she died, he thought maybe he could. They reached Helena late the following afternoon. The territorial capital sprawled along the hillsides, a chaotic jumble of buildings ranging from sturdy brick structures to ramshackle wooden lean-tos. The streets churned with activity, miners and merchants and gamblers all jostling for space and advantage. Caleb felt immediately on edge. Cities were dangerous in ways the prairie was not. Out on the plains, you could see threats coming from miles away. In cities, danger wore a friendly face and slipped a knife between your ribs before you knew you'd been played. They found Harrison Fletcher's office on a quieter side street, squeezed between a lawyer's practice and a dry goods store. The sign above the door read, "Document Examination and Notary Services," in fading gold letters. Caleb dismounted and helped the woman down, then tied both horses to the rail. Inside, the office smelled of old paper and tobacco. Fletcher himself was a thin man in his late 50s, with spectacles perched on a narrow nose and ink stains on his fingers. He looked up as they entered, his expression professionally neutral. "Help you?" he asked. Caleb placed the forged promissory note on Fletcher's desk. "I need you to prove this signature is fake." Fletcher picked up the document, held it close to his face, then carried it to the window where the light was better. He examined it for several minutes, occasionally making small humming sounds. Finally, he set it down and looked at Caleb. "You have a sample of your real signature?" Caleb pulled out a receipt from Josiah Miller's store, dated 1878, bearing his genuine signature. Fletcher compared the two documents side by side using a magnifying glass to study the minutest details. "The pressure is different," Fletcher said, pointing with a pencil. "See here? Your real signature has heavier pressure on the downstrokes, lighter on the curves. Whoever forged this tried to copy the shape, but couldn't replicate the natural rhythm of how you write. And look at the angle of the letters. Yours leans slightly right. The forgery is almost vertical." He straightened. "This is definitely a fake. I can provide written testimony for court." Relief flooded through Caleb like cold water. "How much?" $20 for the examination and affidavit." Caleb counted out the money, leaving him with almost nothing. Fletcher wrote up his findings on official paper, signed it and stamped it, then placed it in a leather folder. "Good luck with your case, Mr. Thorne," Fletcher said. "Men like Webb rarely stop at one attempt. Watch your back." "I intend to." They emerged from the office into late afternoon sun. The woman was smiling, genuine relief brightening her face. "We did it. We got the proof. Now we just have to get it to Judge Harlan before Webb tries something else." They were halfway to their horses when Caleb felt it, that old battlefield instinct that had kept him alive when better men died. The sense of being watched. He turned slowly, scanning the street. There, across the way, partially hidden in an alley, stood one of Webb's men. Caleb recognized him from the market in Silver Ridge. The man saw that he'd been spotted and disappeared into the shadows. "We need to move," Caleb said quietly. "Now." They mounted quickly and rode out of Helena at a pace just short of suspicious. Caleb kept checking behind them, seeing nothing but feeling everything. Webb knew. Of course he knew. And that meant Thomas was alone at the homestead, potentially facing exactly the kind of trouble Caleb had hoped to avoid. "We ride through the night," Caleb said. "Forget rest. We get home before they do." The woman nodded, understanding in her eyes. They pushed the horses hard, stopping only briefly to let the animals catch their breath. The moon rose full and bright, turning the prairie into a landscape of silver and shadow. Caleb's body ached from the saddle. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, but he did not slow. As dawn broke on their second day of travel, they crested a rise and saw smoke in the distance. Too much smoke. Coming from the direction of the homestead. Caleb spurred his horse to a full gallop. Behind him, the woman did the same. The miles disappeared beneath pounding hooves, each moment stretching into eternity. When they finally topped the last hill overlooking Caleb's land, they saw the cabin standing but besieged. 5 men on horseback surrounded it, taking cover behind wagons and rocks. Gunfire cracked sporadically, and from inside the cabin, someone was shooting back. Thomas. The boy was alive, holding them off, but for how much longer? Caleb pulled his Winchester from its holster and looked at the woman beside him. Her face was pale but set with determination. She held the revolver he'd taught her to shoot, both hands wrapped around the grip. "Ready?" Caleb asked. "Ready." They charged down the hill together, riding toward the sound of gunfire, toward the home they had built in 3 short days, toward the boy who waited alone in the dark, believing someone would come for him. And someone had. The thunder of hooves on hard earth mixed with the crack of rifle fire as Caleb and the woman raced down the hillside toward the besieged cabin. Caleb's blood ran cold with a familiar terror, the kind he had not felt since the war. The knowledge that someone he cared about was in mortal danger and every second counted. The 5 men surrounding his homestead had not yet noticed their approach, too focused on trying to flush Thomas out of the cabin. 200 yards out, Caleb raised his Winchester and fired while still riding at full gallop. It was a nearly impossible shot, but luck or skill or divine intervention sent the bullet close enough to one of Webb's men that the man dove for cover, shouting a warning to his companions. Now they knew the reinforcements had arrived. Caleb pulled his horse to a sliding halt behind a rocky outcrop about 100 yards from the cabin, the woman pulling up beside him. They dismounted quickly, using the boulders as cover. Caleb could see the situation clearly now. Webb himself stood behind an overturned wagon, directing his men like a general commanding troops. 3 others crouched behind various pieces of cover, taking turns firing at the cabin windows. The 5th man, the one Caleb had nearly hit, scrambled toward a stand of trees. "Thomas!" Caleb shouted. "It's me! Hold your fire!" A moment of silence. Then Thomas's voice, shaky but determined, called back. "They've been here since yesterday. I'm almost out of ammunition." Caleb's jaw tightened. The boy had held off 5 men for nearly a full day. Pride and fear warred in his chest. Pride won, but only barely. He turned to the woman. "Stay here. Fire only if someone tries to flank us. Aim for center mass like I taught you. Don't think, just shoot." She nodded, her face pale but composed. Caleb checked his rifle, counted his remaining ammunition, and made a decision. He could not let this turn into a prolonged siege. Thomas would run out of bullets, water, or courage, probably in that order. This needed to end now. "Webb," Caleb shouted, "call off your men. We can settle this in court. I have proof your note is forged." Webb's voice carried across the dusty space between them, tinged with amusement. "Thorne, you actually went to Helena. I'm impressed. But it doesn't matter. Courts take time. I can end this today. You try to take my land by force, Morrison will arrest you. Morrison's 3 hours away, and accidents happen on homesteads. Tragic fires, people disappearing. The territory's a dangerous place, Thorne. You should know that." Caleb felt the cold calculation of violence settle over him, the way it had during the war. He had hoped to avoid this, had prayed for it even, in his own rough way, but some men only understood force, and Webb was clearly one of them. "Last chance," Caleb called. "Right away now, face justice later. Or stay and face me." Webb laughed. "You're one man, Thorne. I have 5. Math isn't on your side." "Math never is in a gunfight." Caleb moved before Webb could respond, breaking from cover and sprinting at an angle toward a water trough closer to the cabin. Bullets kicked up dirt around his boots, but he was already dropping and rolling behind the trough before any of Webb's men could adjust their aim. From this position, he had a better angle on 2 of them. He rose just high enough to sight down his rifle and fired twice in quick succession. The first shot hit a man in the shoulder, spinning him around with a scream. The second shattered the barrel a man was hiding behind, sending splinters flying into his face and forcing him to retreat, clawing at his eyes. 3 effective combatants left, including Webb. Movement to his left. Caleb turned to see one of Webb's men trying to circle around toward the woman's position. Before Caleb could line up a shot, the sharp crack of a revolver split the air. The man stumbled, grabbing his leg, and fell. The woman had shot him. She looked as surprised as the man she had hit, staring at the smoking gun in her hands with something between horror and fierce satisfaction. But she kept the weapon trained on the wounded man, who wisely decided to stay down. 2 left plus Webb, Caleb muttered to himself. The odds were better, but still dangerous. From the cabin, Thomas fired, his bullet striking the wagon Webb hid behind. The boy was making his ammunition count, trying to keep Webb pinned. Good thinking. Caleb had taught him well in just a few short days. Then everything went wrong at once. One of Webb's remaining men, a lean figure dressed in black, broke from cover and sprinted toward the cabin with shocking speed. He was fast, zigging and zagging to throw off aim, moving like someone with military training. Caleb fired and missed. Thomas fired and missed. The man reached the cabin wall and began kicking at the door with brutal force. Caleb ran. There was no thought involved, no calculation of risk. Thomas was in that cabin, and Caleb would be damned if he let another son die while he stood by helpless. He covered 30 yards in seconds, his body remembering the sprints under fire from decades past. The man in black heard him coming and turned, revolver rising. Caleb did not slow. He crashed into the man full force, both of them going down hard on the packed earth. The revolver flew from the man's hand. They grappled in the dust, trading blows. The man was younger, probably 30, with the wiry strength of someone who lived by violence. He drove a knee into Caleb's ribs, knocking the wind from his lungs. Caleb answered with an elbow to the man's jaw that snapped his head back. They rolled, each trying to gain advantage, until Caleb managed to pin the man's arms and deliver 3 solid punches to his face. The man went limp, unconscious but breathing. Caleb stood, ribs screaming, tasting blood from a split lip. He retrieved the man's revolver and his own rifle, then limped to the cabin door. "Thomas, it's me! Open up!" The door cracked open. Thomas stood there, the Winchester empty in his hands, his face smudged with gunpowder and streaked with sweat. When he saw Caleb, his composure finally broke. He was 14 years old, alone and terrified, and he had held on through sheer force of will. Now that will crumbled. "I thought you weren't coming back," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I'll always come back," Caleb said. He pulled the boy into a brief, fierce embrace, then gently pushed him inside. "Stay down. It's not over." But when Caleb turned back toward the battlefield, he found it was over. Or at least, it had shifted. Webb stood in the open now, his remaining uninjured man beside him. But the man's rifle was pointed not at Caleb, but at Webb himself. The man was young, maybe 25, with a face that had not yet hardened completely into cruelty. "I didn't sign on for this," the young man said, his voice carrying across the space. His name was Jack, Caleb would learn later. "You said this was about collecting a debt. You didn't say nothing about killing homesteaders and kids." Webb's face twisted with rage. "Put that gun down, boy. Don't be stupid." "I already been stupid. Stupid was following you. My pa raised me better than this." Jack's hands shook, but his aim stayed steady. "Mr. Thorne, I'm sorry for my part in this. I'm riding out now. You won't see me again." "Jack, if you walk away from me, you're a dead man," Webb snarled. Jack's eyes hardened. "Reckon I'd rather be a dead man than the kind of man you are." Webb moved fast, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. But Jack was faster. The rifle cracked once, sharp and final. Webb staggered, looking down in disbelief at the red stain spreading across his chest. He took 2 more steps, then fell to his knees, then forward onto his face. Silence settled over the homestead, broken only by the sound of the wind and the groans of the wounded. Jack lowered his rifle slowly, staring at what he had done. Caleb walked toward him carefully, hands visible and non-threatening. "You did the right thing," Caleb said quietly. "I just killed a man. A man who was about to kill you. That's different." Jack looked at Caleb with eyes that suddenly seemed much older. "Don't feel different. It will. Eventually. Takes time." Caleb paused. "Ride to Silver Ridge. Tell Sheriff Morrison what happened. Tell him everything. He's a good man. He'll listen." Jack nodded numbly, climbed onto his horse, and rode away at a walk like a man moving through a dream. Caleb watched him go, recognizing the shell-shocked look of someone whose understanding of themselves had just been violently rearranged. The woman emerged from behind the rocks, the revolver still in her hand. She walked slowly across the scarred earth, looking at the wounded men, the unconscious one, the dead one. When she reached Caleb, she did not speak. She simply stood beside him, her shoulder touching his, both of them shaking with adrenaline and relief. Thomas came out of the cabin, still carrying the empty Winchester like a talisman. He looked at Webb's body, then quickly looked away. Too young to see such things, Caleb thought. But then Samuel had been young too. The world did not care about age when it came to hard lessons. "Is it over?" Thomas asked. Before Caleb could answer, the sound of multiple horses drew their attention. Sheriff Morrison crested the hill with 6 deputies, all armed, all scanning the scene with professional wariness. Morrison took in the tableau, the wounded men, the dead one, the boy with the empty rifle, and Caleb standing in the middle of it all, looking like he had been through a war. "Seems I'm late to the party," Morrison said, dismounting. "We held them off," Caleb said simply. Morrison walked to Webb's body, knelt, checked for a pulse he would not find. "Jack Brennan rode into town an hour ago, told me everything. Webb's forgery, the siege, all of it. That boy might have just saved himself from the noose by coming clean." He stood. "You have the proof from Fletcher?" Caleb nodded, retrieving the leather folder from his saddlebag. Morrison read through Fletcher's affidavit, his expression darkening as he processed the implications. "This is enough to clear you with Judge Harlan. Webb's claim dies with him." Morrison looked around at the other men. "The wounded ones will face charges for attempted murder, assault, destruction of property. They'll hang or go to territorial prison. Either way, they're done." 2 deputies began securing the prisoners while others tended to their wounds. One of the wounded men, the one the woman had shot in the leg, looked at her with something between respect and fear. "You got good aim for a beginner," he said. "I had good reason not to miss," she replied coldly. Morrison supervised the cleanup with brisk efficiency, taking statements from Caleb, Thomas, and the woman. The sun climbed higher, turning the morning cool into afternoon heat. By the time the prisoners were loaded onto horses for transport to Silver Ridge, Caleb felt exhaustion settling into his bones like lead. Morrison paused before mounting his horse. "You did good, Caleb. Better than most would have. You protected your family." The word hung in the air between them. Family. That was what they were becoming, Caleb realized. Not by blood, not by law yet, but by choice and shared survival. The strongest bonds forged in fire. After Morrison and his men rode away with the prisoners and Webb's body, the three of them stood in the yard, looking at the damage. Bullet holes pocked the cabin walls. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Shell casings littered the ground like brass seeds, but the cabin stood. They stood. And that counted for something. "We need to fix things," Caleb said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Tomorrow," the woman said firmly. "Today we rest." They went inside together. The woman found the medical kit and tended to Caleb's split lip and bruised ribs while Thomas pumped fresh water and started coffee. They moved around each other with new familiarity, the kind born from facing death together and choosing to live anyway. That evening, they sat at the table sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. No one spoke much. There was no need. They had said everything that mattered with bullets and blood and the simple act of refusing to give up. As twilight settled over the prairie, Caleb stood on the porch, looking toward the hill where Samuel and Sarah rested. The woman came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. "Do you think they would approve?" she asked quietly. "Of us, of this?" Caleb thought of it, really thought of it. Sarah always said a house wasn't worth much if it didn't have people to fill it with laughter. Samuel wanted to build things that lasted. I think they'd both be happy that this place is becoming a home again. "I want to stay," the woman said, "not as someone you saved, but as someone who chooses to be here, with you." Caleb turned to face her. In the dying light, she looked stronger than the broken woman he had bought in a market square 5 days ago. She had shot a man today to protect herself and others. She had ridden through the night to bring proof of forgery. She had not run when running would have been easier. "I want you to stay," Caleb said. "But there's something I need to say first. I'm falling in love with you. Maybe already have fallen, and that terrifies me because I know what it costs to lose someone you love. But I'm tired of being afraid. Tired of just surviving instead of living." Tears gathered in her eyes but did not fall. "I'm falling in love with you too, and yes, it terrifies me. Every man I've known has hurt me. But you're different. You see me as a person. You ask what I want. You trust me with guns and keys and truth. That's more than love. That's respect." "I respect you," Caleb confirmed, "more than you know." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face from pretty to beautiful. "I've decided on a name. For myself." "Tell me." "Alara. It means starlight. You and Thomas are the stars that guided me out of darkness." "Alara," Caleb repeated, testing the sound of it. "It's perfect." He took her hand, raised it to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently. It was old-fashioned and probably foolish and completely sincere. She laughed, a sound like bells, and Caleb realized it was the first time he had heard her truly laugh. Inside the cabin, Thomas watched them through the window. He felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Hope, maybe, or belonging. For 13 years he had been shuffled from place to place, never welcome, never wanted. Now he stood in a cabin that had bullet holes in the walls because 3 people had chosen to defend it together. Because it was worth defending. Because they were worth defending. He touched the empty Winchester, remembering the weight of it, the fear and determination of holding off 5 men alone. He had been brave today. Caleb had told him so, and for the first time in his life, Thomas believed he might actually be worth something. "Thank you, Samuel," Thomas whispered to the brother he never knew, the ghost who had made room for him in a dead boy's clothes and a living man's heart. "I'll take care of them. I promise." Outside, Caleb and Alara stood together watching stars emerge one by one from the darkening sky. The prairie stretched away in all directions, vast and indifferent. But here, in this small circle of light and warmth, 3 people had found each other against impossible odds. And tomorrow, when the sun rose again, they would begin the work of building something that could last. Something like family. Something like home. something worth fighting for. The days following the siege fell into a rhythm of repair and renewal. 2 weeks passed in steady work. Caleb rose each morning with the sun, his ribs still tender but healing, and set about fixing what violence had broken. Thomas worked beside him, learning to patch bullet holes with fresh plaster, to plane new wood for the damaged door, to smooth rough edges into something that could protect them through the coming winter. Ilara managed the household with quiet efficiency, cooking meals that grew more ambitious as she discovered Caleb's modest supply of spices and her own forgotten knowledge of how food could be more than mere fuel. 2 weeks passed, the autumn air grew sharper, carrying the promise of early snow. Caleb watched the northern sky with the wariness of a man who had survived too many Montana winters to take them lightly. The cabin needed to be ready, the barn needed reinforcing, the root cellar needed stocking. Winter on the prairie was not forgiving of poor preparation. 3 weeks after the siege, on a morning when frost painted the grass silver, Sheriff Morrison returned. He rode alone this time, his horse moving at an easy pace that suggested the visit was not urgent. Caleb met him in the yard, wiping sawdust from his hands. "James," Caleb said by way of greeting. "Caleb." Morrison dismounted, his weathered face creased with something that might have been approval. "Came to give you news. Judge Harlan reviewed Fletcher's affidavit. Webb's claim is officially dismissed. Your land is secure. No liens, no debts, no challenges. It's yours free and clear." The relief that washed through Caleb was profound, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "What about the men who rode with Webb?" "3 will hang. The one your lady shot in the leg got 10 years territorial prison. And Jack Brennan, the one who shot Webb, is being released with time served. Judge ruled it was self-defense." Morrison paused. "That boy came by my office yesterday, asked me to give you something." Morrison handed Caleb a folded piece of paper. Caleb opened it to find a short letter written in careful, unpracticed script. "Mr. Thorne, I am sorry for the trouble I brought to your door. You showed me mercy when you could have shot me dead. That mercy is why I found the courage to do the right thing. I am heading to California to find honest work. Maybe start over. Thank you for reminding me what kind of man my father wanted me to be. Jack Brennan." Caleb folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "He's young. Maybe he'll make something of himself." "Maybe," Morrison agreed. "World needs men willing to change course when they realize they're walking the wrong path." He glanced toward the cabin, where Ilara stood in the doorway watching. "Speaking of paths, you planning to make things official with her?" Caleb followed Morrison's gaze. Ilara wore one of Sarah's old dresses, altered to fit her smaller frame, her hair pulled back in a practical braid. She looked nothing like Sarah, but she filled the space Sarah had left with her own particular light. "I am. Soon." "Good. She's solid. And that boy, Thomas. He held off 5 men for near a full day. That takes backbone most grown men don't have. He's stronger than he knows." Morrison clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "You've built yourself a family, Caleb. First good thing I've seen you do for yourself in 8 years. Don't waste it." After Morrison left, Caleb stood in the yard for a long moment, thinking about what came next. He had won the legal battle. He had defended his land. He had kept Thomas and Ilara safe. But safety was not the same as permanence. He needed to give them something more than protection. He needed to give them a future. That afternoon, Caleb saddled his mare and rode to Silver Ridge alone. He told Thomas and Ilara he needed supplies, which was true but not the whole truth. What he really needed was Josiah Miller's advice, and a particular item Miller kept locked in his store's back room. Miller's general store occupied the center of Silver Ridge's main street, a sturdy brick building that had weathered 15 Montana winters without complaint. Caleb found the old shopkeeper behind the counter, inventorying bolts of fabric with the meticulous care of a man who knew the value of every item he stocked. "Caleb Thorne," Miller said, looking up with a gap-toothed smile. "Heard you had some excitement out at your place." "More than I wanted, but less than you could handle, seems like." Miller set down his pencil. "What brings you to town?" Caleb glanced around the empty store, then lowered his voice. "I need to buy a ring for a proposal." Miller's eyebrows climbed toward his thinning hairline. "Well, I'll be damned. Sarah would be pleased. She always said you needed someone to civilize you." "I don't know about civilized, but I need someone, and she needs security. Legal protection, a name that can't be taken away. Miller nodded, understanding the practicalities beneath the romance. A married woman had legal standing that an unmarried one did not. She could own property, sign contracts, make decisions. On the frontier, where law was thin and survival was everything, marriage was as much about survival as love. I've got 3 rings in the back. Came from a widow in Miles City who needed cash more than memories. I'll show you. Miller led Caleb to a small room behind the store where he kept valuable items locked away. He opened a wooden box lined with faded velvet and revealed 3 rings. One was ornate, studded with small stones that caught the light. Another was plain gold, worn thin by years of wear. The third was silver, simple but well crafted, with a single small stone set flush with the band. Caleb picked up the silver ring, feeling its weight. This one, idiot. Good choice, that's a sapphire. Small but real. $20. It was nearly all of the money Caleb had left after buying supplies. But money could be earned. Moments like this could not be recreated. He counted out the coins and Miller wrapped the ring in a piece of soft cloth. You know, Miller said as Caleb pocketed the ring, Sarah's wedding ring is still up at your place somewhere, isn't it? Caleb had thought about that. Sarah's ring was in a wooden box under his bed, along with a few other items he had kept as remembrances. It is. You could use that. Save yourself $20. No, Ilara deserves her own ring, her own beginning, not a hand-me-down from my past. Miller smiled. You're a good man, Caleb. Better than most. That girl is lucky. I'm the lucky one. Caleb bought the other supplies he needed, flour and coffee and ammunition, then rode back toward the homestead. But instead of going straight home, he detoured to the hill where Sarah and Samuel rested. He had not visited since the day of the siege, too caught up in the immediate work of survival to make time for the dead. He dismounted at the base of the hill and climbed on foot, his boots crunching through frost-hardened grass. 2 simple wooden markers stood side by side, weathered by 8 years of wind and rain. Caleb had carved their names himself, deep enough that the letters would last as long as the wood. He knelt between the graves, placing one hand on each marker. Sarah, Samuel. His voice was low, meant for them alone. I need to tell you something. There's a woman. Her name is Ilara. She's been through hell and came out stronger. She's smart and brave, and she makes me want to be better than I am. I'm going to ask her to marry me. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying the scent of coming snow. I know I said I'd never love anyone else. I meant it when I said it. But 8 years is a long time to live in darkness. And she brought light back. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'll always love you, Sarah. You were my first love, the mother of my son. But you're gone, and I'm still here, and I need to live, not just survive. He turned to Samuel's marker. And son, there's a boy. His name is Thomas. He's 14. Brave as they come. Held off 5 men by himself while I was gone. He reminds me of you. Same stubborn courage, same good heart. I can't replace you. I won't try. But maybe I can give this boy the life you should have had. Maybe that's how I honor your memory, by being the father to him that I should have been to you. A raven called from a nearby pine tree, harsh and insistent. Caleb stood, his knees protesting the movement. He looked down at the graves one last time. I hope you understand. I hope wherever you are, you want me to be happy, because for the first time since you died, I think I might be. He descended the hill as afternoon light turned gold, painting the prairie in shades of amber and rust. When he reached the homestead, he found Thomas splitting firewood with focused intensity, building the stockpile they would need for winter. The boy had grown into the work over the past weeks, his thin frame developing the wiry strength of someone who labored daily. Thomas, Caleb called. The boy set down his axe and walked over, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. Yes, sir? Caleb pulled out a small leather pouch from his saddlebag. Inside were 5 silver dollars. This is yours, payment for the work you've done, and the courage you showed during the siege. Thomas stared at the money like it might disappear if he looked away. I didn't do it for money. I know, but a man deserves to be paid for his labor. You've earned this. Thomas took the pouch hesitantly. Thank you. There's something else. Caleb paused, weighing his words. I'm going to ask Alara to marry me. If she says yes, I'll be asking her to take my name. Thorn, I'd like you to take it too. Legally. I'll file the papers with the territorial court. You'd be Thomas Thorn, my son, in law if not in blood. The boy's eyes went wide. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Finally, he managed, "You want to adopt me?" "I do, if you're willing." "Why?" It was the same question Thomas had asked in the market square 2 weeks ago, and Caleb gave him the same truth expanded. Because Samuel died before he could become a man, before he could have sons of his own, before he could carry our name forward. You can do those things. You can have the life he should have had. That's not replacing him. It's honoring him. Thomas's face crumpled and he turned away, shoulders shaking with tears he had held back for too long. Caleb stepped forward and pulled the boy into an embrace, letting him cry against his shoulder the way Samuel used to when the world felt too big and too frightening. "I've never had a real family," Thomas said between sobs. "People who wanted me, who chose me. You have one now, if you want it." Thomas pulled back, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "I want it, more than anything." Caleb gripped the boy's shoulder. "Then it's settled. Now I just have to convince Alara." That evening, Caleb asked Alara to walk with him after dinner. She agreed, wrapping herself in a shawl against the evening chill. They walked in silence toward the small creek that marked the eastern boundary of Caleb's land, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. The sun had set, leaving the sky awash in purple and deep blue. When they reached the creek, Caleb stopped. "I need to tell you something about Sarah." Alara went very still, her expression carefully neutral. "She was my first love. We married when I was 23, had Samuel a year later. She was the kindest person I ever knew. Patient, wise. She taught school and loved it. When she died, part of me died too. I thought that was it. One love in a lifetime and mine was over." He turned to face Alara fully. "But I was wrong. The heart is bigger than I knew. And you've shown me that loving you doesn't mean forgetting her. It means choosing to live again, to hope again." Alara's eyes shimmered in the fading light. "I'm afraid of this, of us. Every time I've trusted someone, they've hurt me. I know, and I can't promise I'll never hurt you, because people hurt each other even when they don't mean to. But I can promise I'll never betray you, never sell you, never treat you as less than my equal." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver ring. "Alara, will you marry me?" She stared at the ring, then at him, then back at the ring. Tears spilled down her cheeks, catching the last light. "You bought this? With the money you need for winter supplies?" "I bought it because you deserve something that's yours alone. Not Sarah's old ring, not a hand-me-down, something new, for our new beginning." "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Caleb slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the sapphire catching what little light remained. He pulled her close and kissed her, deep and tender, a promise made flesh. When they parted, both were trembling, not from cold, but from the magnitude of what they had just done. "I want a simple ceremony," Alara said. "Just us and Thomas and whoever can serve as witness. I don't need a church or fancy clothes. I just need you. We'll go to Silver Ridge next week. Judge Harlan can marry us. It'll be legal and binding, and no one can ever question it." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, stars emerging overhead like distant fires. Inside, Thomas saw the ring on Alara's finger and let out a whoop of joy that made them both laugh. They sat together at the table, the three of them, and talked late into the night about the future. About expanding the homestead, about teaching Thomas to read better, about the children Caleb and Alara might have someday. For the first time in 8 years, Caleb let himself imagine a future beyond mere survival. He saw grandchildren running through these fields. He saw Thomas grown and married, building his own cabin on the far side of the property. He saw Alara gray-haired and content, rocking in a chair on the porch while the sun set over land they had worked together for decades. It was a good vision, worth fighting for, worth protecting. That night, after Thomas had fallen asleep and Alara had retired to the bed, Caleb sat alone by the fire with Samuel's old pocket watch in his hands. The watch no longer worked, its mechanism frozen by time and disuse. But Caleb had kept it anyway. a talisman of love and loss. "We're going to be all right, son," he whispered to the silent watch. "All of us. I promise you that." Outside, the Montana wind sang through the pines, carrying with it the first flakes of winter snow. And inside the small cabin on the prairie, three people slept beneath one roof, bound by choice and survival, in something that was beginning to feel like family. Winter arrived in earnest 3 days before the wedding, sweeping down from the Canadian territories with the kind of cold that made a man's breath freeze in his lungs. Snow fell in thick curtains, transforming the Montana prairie into an endless expanse of white, broken only by dark stands of pine and the occasional rocky outcrop. Caleb watched the storm from the cabin window, coffee cup warming his hands, and felt grateful for the preparations they had made. The root cellar was full. Firewood stood stacked to the rafters in the lean-to. The animals had shelter and feed. They would survive this winter, and the next, and the ones after that. Behind him, Alara sat at the table working on her dress. She had bought simple white fabric from Miller's store and spent the past week cutting and sewing by lamplight, her stitches neat despite her claims of inexperience. Thomas lounged in the rocking chair, reading aloud from one of Caleb's old books, stumbling over difficult words but improving daily. The domestic scene filled something in Caleb's chest that had been hollow for 8 years. This was what he had lost. This was what he had found again. "The storm will clear by tomorrow," Caleb said. "We can still make it to Silver Ridge for the ceremony." Ilara looked up from her sewing. "Even in this snow?" "I've traveled in worse, and I'm not waiting another week to make you my wife." She smiled, that private smile she saved only for him. Impatient man. When a man finds what he's been missing, he doesn't waste time. Thomas closed his book with a thump. "Are you two going to be this sweet all the time now? Because it's making me feel like I should leave the room." They all laughed, the sound warm and genuine. These moments of ease had become more frequent over the past weeks, the initial wariness giving way to the comfortable rhythm of people who knew they belonged together. The storm did clear, as Caleb had predicted. By morning, the sky opened into brilliant blue, the sun reflecting off snow so bright it hurt to look at directly. They dressed in their best clothes, which for Caleb meant a suit he had not worn since Sarah's funeral, and for Thomas meant the only clean shirt he owned. Alara emerged from behind the privacy screen wearing her white dress, her dark hair pinned up with small wildflowers she had dried and saved from autumn. She looked beautiful in the way of real things, unadorned and honest. The ride to Silver Ridge took 3 hours through snow-packed roads. Other homesteaders had already broken the trail with their wagons, making the journey possible if not easy. They arrived at noon to find the town busy with people conducting business before the next storm rolled in. Word of their wedding had spread somehow, the way news always did in small frontier towns, and several people called out congratulations as they passed. Judge Harlan's office occupied the second floor of the territorial courthouse, a brick building that served as the center of whatever law existed in this part of Montana. The judge himself was 70 if he was a day, with white hair that stood up in wild tufts and spectacles that magnified his pale blue eyes to comic proportions. But his mind was sharp and his respect for the law absolute. "Mr. Thorne," Harlan said, rising from behind his desk, "I heard you had quite an adventure with Silas Webb. Glad to see justice prevailed." "Thank you, Your Honor. We're here to be married." Harlan's eyes moved to Alara, then to Thomas. "This the young lady in question?" "Alara," she said, stepping forward and offering her hand. "No last name yet. That's why we're here." Harlan shook her hand with grave courtesy. A woman choosing her own name and her own future. That's the spirit that built this territory. He gestured to Thomas. "And who's this young man?" "Thomas," Caleb said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "After we're married, I'll be filing adoption papers for him as well. He'll be Thomas Thorne." Harlan nodded approvingly. "Family by choice rather than chance. Nothing wrong with that." He pulled out a leather-bound book and a pen. "We'll need 2 witnesses. Do you have anyone?" The door opened before Caleb could answer. Sheriff Morrison entered, followed by Josiah Miller and his wife Ruth, a stout woman with kind eyes and flour permanently embedded under her fingernails from years of baking. "Heard you might need witnesses," Morrison said. "Figured we'd volunteer." Caleb felt something catch in his throat. These people owed him nothing, yet they had come to stand with him on a day that mattered. "Thank you," he managed. The ceremony was brief and practical. as frontier weddings tended to be. Judge Harlan read the legal requirements in a voice that had married hundreds of couples and buried nearly as many. He asked if Caleb took Alara to be his lawful wife, to honor and protect, in sickness and health, for as long as they both lived. Caleb said yes without hesitation. He asked if Alara took Caleb to be her lawful husband, to honor and stand beside in hardship and prosperity, for as long as they both lived. Alara's voice was clear and strong when she said yes. Then by the authority vested in me by Montana Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Thorne, you may kiss your bride. Caleb cupped Alara's face gently and kissed her with all the tenderness and promise he possessed. When they parted, her eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. Thomas whooped, and the small gathering applauded. They signed the marriage certificate, Alara's hand shaking slightly as she wrote her new name for the first time, Alara Thorne. Two words that meant she belonged to herself and to this man who had given her freedom to choose. Morrison and the Miller signed as witnesses, making it official and binding under territorial law. Afterward, Ruth Miller insisted they come to her house for a wedding meal. I baked a cake this morning, she said, brooking no argument. Knew you'd need something proper to celebrate. They walked together through Silver Ridge's snowy streets to the Miller house, a neat cabin on the edge of town with smoke curling from its chimney. Inside, the warmth was overwhelming after the cold, and the smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread made Caleb realize how hungry he was. They sat at the Miller's table. 6 people crammed around space meant for 4, and ate food that tasted like celebration. Thomas ate 3 pieces of cake and would have had a 4th if Alara had not stopped him. Morrison told stories from the war that made Caleb both laugh and wince at the memories. Josiah and Ruth reminisced about their own wedding 40 years ago, when Montana was even wilder and survival even less certain. As the afternoon wore on and the light began to fade, Caleb stood and raised his coffee cup. I want to thank you all for coming today, for standing with us, for reminding me that even out here on the edge of civilization, people can still be good to each other. Morrison raised his own cup. To the Thorns, may your homestead prosper and your family grow. To the Thorns, the others echoed. They rode home in the twilight, the temperature dropping fast now that the sun had set. None of them spoke much, too full of food and contentment to need words. When they crested the final hill and saw the cabin below, a single light burning in the window where Caleb had left a lamp, Alara said quietly, I've never had a home before. Not a real one. Places to sleep, yes, but not a home. You have one now, Caleb said, for as long as you want it. I want it forever. That night, after Thomas had fallen asleep in his corner of the cabin, Caleb and Alara lay together in the bed that had once been his alone. They were both nervous, despite being in their 20s and 40s, respectively. This was different from mere physical joining. This was the beginning of something meant to last. Are you afraid? Alara whispered in the darkness. Terrified, Caleb admitted, of failing you, of not being enough. You're already enough. You were enough the day you asked if I wanted to leave that market square. She turned toward him, her hand finding his in the dark. We're going to build something good here. I can feel it. They made love slowly, carefully, 2 people learning each other's landscape with gentle exploration. When they finally fell asleep, tangled together beneath heavy quilts, the wind howled outside, but the cabin held firm. They were safe. They were together. They were home. The winter that followed was hard, as Montana winters always were. Snow piled 6 feet high in drifts against the cabin walls. The temperature dropped so low that water left out overnight froze solid within minutes. They burned through wood faster than Caleb liked, though not so fast that they risked running out. Thomas learned to check the animals in whiteout conditions, navigating by feel and memory when visibility dropped to nothing. Alara mastered the art of making small amounts of food stretch further than seemed possible, but they also found joy in the isolation. Long evenings by the fire where Caleb taught Thomas about stars and weather patterns. Card games played by lamplight where no one kept score. Stories told and retold until they became part of the family mythology. Alara taught both Caleb and Thomas to read better, patiently correcting pronunciation and explaining difficult words. Thomas taught them both a Lakota song his mother had sung to him before she died, the melody haunting and beautiful. By the time spring arrived, melting the snow and turning the prairie green again, They had become something more than three people sharing space. They had become a unit, each person's strength compensating for another's weakness, each person's presence making the others more complete. In late April, Caleb stood in his newly plowed field, running dark soil through his fingers and feeling satisfied with its richness. The wheat he planted this year would be good, maybe the best crop he had ever grown. Behind him, Thomas drove the plow with growing skill, the horse responding to his commands. And further back, near the cabin, Alara hung laundry on a line they had strung between two posts, her movements efficient and content. Sheriff Morrison rode out one afternoon with news from Silver Ridge. Thought you'd want to know. Jack Brennan sent a letter from California. Got himself work on a ranch near Sacramento. Says he's staying clean, trying to live right. Asked me to tell you thank you again. Caleb felt pleased by this information, though not surprised. Men could change if given reason and opportunity. He hoped Jack found both. There's something else, Morrison continued. Judge Harlan approved Thomas's adoption. It's official. He's your son in the eyes of the law. Caleb found Thomas in the barn, mucking out stalls with the stoic patience the work required. Thomas, need to talk to you. The boy set down his pitchfork, worry flickering across his face. Did I do something wrong? No, did something very right, actually. Caleb handed him the adoption papers. It's official. You're Thomas Thorne now, my son. Thomas stared at the document, his lips moving as he read the legal language. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. Does this mean I have to call you Pa? You can call me whatever feels right. Thomas thought about this. I think I'd like to call you Pa if that's all right. It's more than all right. They embraced, awkward and fierce, two people who had found in each other something both had thought lost forever. When they separated, both were wiping their eyes and pretending they were not. That summer was the most productive of Caleb's life. The wheat grew tall and golden. The garden Alara had planted yielded vegetables in abundance. They sold their surplus in Silver Ridge and saved nearly $100, more money than Caleb had ever had at one time. With it, they bought lumber to expand the cabin, adding a second room so Thomas could have privacy as he grew toward manhood. In August, Alara told Caleb she was pregnant. They had suspected for a few weeks but had not wanted to speak it aloud, as if doing so might jinx the fragile hope. When the doctor from Helena confirmed it during his monthly circuit through the territory, they allowed themselves to celebrate. Due in March, the doctor said, packing his instruments back into his worn leather bag. Assuming no complications. She's healthy and strong. Should be fine. That night, lying in bed with Alara's head on his shoulder, Caleb felt fear and joy warring in his chest. I lost Samuel when he was 12. I don't know if I can survive losing another child. You won't lose this one. I'm stronger than Sarah was. No offense to her memory. None taken, you are strong. Strongest person I know. We're going to name her Sarah if it's a girl, and Samuel if it's a boy. It was not a question, and Caleb loved her for the certainty of it. Yes, he agreed, we will. The baby came early on a frozen February night when the wind screamed like something alive and trying to get in. Caleb rode through the darkness to fetch Ruth Miller while Thomas stayed with Alara, holding her hand and trying not to show his terror. By the time Caleb returned with Ruth, Alara was deep in labor, her face pale but determined. You men get out, Ruth ordered, taking charge with the unquestioned authority of a woman who had birthed 5 children and midwife 20 more. This is women's work. Go boil water or chop wood or something useful that's not in here. Caleb and Thomas retreated to the barn, where they sat in the hay and listened to the muffled sounds coming from the cabin. Every cry from Alara made Caleb flinch, memories of Sarah's final days mixing with present fear until he could barely breathe. She's strong, Thomas said, echoing Alara's own words. She'll be all right. You can't know that. No, but I believe it, and sometimes that has to be enough. Caleb gripped the boy's shoulder, drawing strength from his simple faith. They waited in silence as the night deepened and the cold intensified. Just when Caleb thought he could not bear another moment of uncertainty, a new sound cut through the wind, the unmistakable cry of a newborn baby. They ran to the cabin, bursting through the door to find Ruth holding a squirming bundle wrapped in clean cloth. Alara lay exhausted on the bed, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, but she was smiling. It's a girl, Ruth announced, small but healthy, Good lungs on her. Caleb approached the bed slowly, almost afraid this was a dream that would dissolve if he moved too quickly. Alara reached for him and he took her hand, then looked down at the baby Ruth placed in his arms. She was tiny, impossibly so, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn brown once the newborn blue faded. She had Alara's nose and his chin, a perfect blend of them both. Sarah Ann Thorne, Alara said, do you approve? Caleb could not speak past the lump in his throat. He nodded, tears streaming freely down his face. Thomas came to stand beside him, peering at his new sister with wonder. She's so small, Thomas whispered. How do we not break her? Very carefully, Ruth said with a chuckle. Don't worry, babies are tougher than they look. That night, after Ruth had gone home and Thomas had fallen asleep, Caleb sat in the rocking chair with Sarah Ann in his arms, watching her sleep. Alara dozed in the bed, exhausted but content. The lamp burned low, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Caleb thought about the path that had brought him here. The war, Sarah's death, 8 years of loneliness. The day he walked into Silver Ridge Market and saw a woman who needed saving as much as he needed to save someone. All of it, the pain and loss and fear, had led to this moment, to this child sleeping in his arms, to this family he had built from broken pieces. I don't know if you can hear me, he whispered to whatever spirits might be listening, to Sarah and Samuel in their graves on the hill, to the wind and stars in the vast, indifferent prairie. But thank you for this second chance, for Alara and Thomas and this baby. I promise I won't waste it. I'll protect them, love them, give them the life they deserve. Outside, the wind began to ease, as if his words had satisfied something that needed satisfying. And in his arms, Sarah Ann Thorne slept on, dreaming whatever dreams newborns dream, unaware that she had been born into a family held together by choice and courage, and a love that refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. The homestead endured, the family grew, and on a small rise overlooking a Montana valley, 3 wooden markers stood together, not forgotten but no longer alone in their vigil. Below them, smoke rose from a cabin chimney. Children's laughter carried on the wind, and life, stubborn and persistent and beautiful, continued, as it always had, as it always would.